My name is Heather Boughton, and I'm the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Advanced Analytics at the Department of Education. This presentation is a presentation on selecting evidence-based interventions. This is kind of a two-part presentation. I'm going to kick us off and then turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Liz Davis from REL Midwest, who is going to give you a lot more detail about the definitions around tiers of evidence and how to use existing resources to find interventions that meet certain tiers of evidence. To just recap, we're going to introduce concepts and definitions. We know, people are going to be coming to this discussion from various points of knowledge and experience and skills. I want to talk through what I'm kind of referring to as the 5 steps to being empowered by evidence. And so these are sort of very general key takeaways. So as I said, Dr. Davis is going to get into a lot of detail. And you may leave here sort of, I don't want anyone to leave here feeling overwhelmed. I want you to leave here knowing, having a baseline of knowledge here. We're presenting this information to you as a starting point and as a resource. We don't want it to be a barrier to anyone leveraging evidence-based information and interventions. And so what I want to convey to you is these sort of 5, if you're having a hard time retaining all of that other statistical detail, walking away with these 5 steps will give you a good starting basis for using evidence-based interventions. And then Liz is going to help build your practical knowledge around how to carry out this work. And before we get into some of the specific material, I want to share my sort of 3.5 C's to keep in the back of your mind as we're talking here today. The first is confidence. So again, we're going to be talking about some statistical concepts here. Some of you will love that. You're going to revel in it. You're data geeks, and you love talking about randomized control trials and all that great stuff. And for some of you, maybe that's not really your cup of tea. For some of you, you're realizing this was not the session you meant to come to, and you're trying to figure out how to get out. But what I really want you to walk away from this feeling is that you can be confident that you can use evidence-based interventions to carry out your work. You don't have to have a PhD in statistics to do this work and to benefit from the value in using evidence-based interventions. Our role as the state is to help you get there and provide the resources and materials that will help you get there. And that's really, I feel very strongly that that's what we need to be doing. So again, a lot of this is new stuff, and our resources are evolving, so I'd love to hear more from you about what would be helpful to you all. But be confident. This is for you. Whether you love randomized control trials or not, this is for you. The second sort of underlying principle to always keep in mind here is context is very important. So we're going to talk about how to identify interventions that you can be really confident will work because they've been evaluated. But if they've been evaluated in a setting or a context or for outcomes that have nothing to do with your own specific needs, then it's not really an evidence-based intervention for you. I mean, it's not a good fit for you. So you're coming from different districts, different schools, you have different students with different needs, and that's really important to keep in mind as you're thinking about what's going to be the best fit for you. And then this is why I've titled this slide 3.5, because cycle of continuous improvement has 2 C's, and I spent a lot of time thinking about, is that these 3 C's, 4 C's? I don't know, it's a gray area. And then I thought, I'm spending too much time thinking about this. Let's just solve the problem a different way. So 3.5 C's. We are talking about a specific part of a cycle of continuous improvement, selecting evidence-based interventions. It's not a standalone activity that you carry out. Before you get to that point, you'll have gone through a needs assessment process to figure out what are your specific district and student needs that you're going to address through this grant or through other work. And then you go through the process of finding interventions that fit those needs. And then the work doesn't stop there, right? Then you want to know, is it working for me? What is working or what isn't working? How can I adjust what I'm doing to make it a better fit for my district. So, you know, what we don't want you to walk away from is feeling like all I got to do is figure out how to check that box in this application and I'm done, I've got it. It's not just a check the box kind of concept. This can be a really powerful concept for you to use as you're applying for grants or even just as you're thinking more broadly and generally on a day-to-day basis about how you're doing your work. But it is part of a cycle. What does it mean to talk about an intervention being evidence-based? So the Every Student Succeeds Act does reference interventions needing to be evidence-based. There's also some non-regulatory guidance that the US Department of Education has put out there that further defines what this means. And so we will talk about this a little bit. Some of you may be familiar with the phrase scientifically based. That was what was used in No Child Left Behind. It's a very similar concept. ESSA provides more detail and more definition about what they mean when they say this. So with scientifically based, there was sort of this, again, a kind of a gray area of what does that mean. We have a little bit more guidance now about what this means. So I also want to note that what ESSA does as it's defining this is it causes us to need to be more precise in our language. And so, you know, this is a catchphrase right now, or a really, it's a buzzword, referring to things as being evidence-based. So we do need, because there is a definition out there, we do need to be precise about how we're using that phrase. But I also don't want us to go to some other extreme where if it doesn't meet those exact definitions, it's worthless, because that's not true either. There are a lot of things out there, a lot of really good research, really good work being done out there that may not meet specific definitions, but is really valuable information to have and can really be informative for you in your work. So this is not a situation where if it doesn't meet specific definitions, we don't want to talk about it. We do, we just need to be cognizant of the fact that meeting certain definitions gets you to certain places and can help support you in different ways. Okay, so this is the actual language from ESSA. We're not going to read through this here right now. I felt compelled to include it here. You can go back and look at it when you download the slides from our webpage, but it does exist. It is here. And I am going to give just a very high-level overview of a few key concepts here, and then Liz is going to give a much more detailed definition, or a much more detailed unpacking of this definition when she speaks. So in general, the idea here is that interventions meet different tiers of evidence, and knowing which tiers of evidence that intervention meets and understanding sort of the basics of those tiers can help you determine sort of what level of confidence you can have that an intervention will be likely to meet your needs. And those tiers are based on the design and the outcomes of the research evaluations. And that is an important point to keep in mind, because there are a lot of existing resources out there that assess evaluations associated with interventions. And some of them will focus on the design piece, but not necessarily the outcomes. So it's important to remember that in ESSA, the focus is on both. You need to keep in mind the outcomes piece. In general, tiers 1, tiers 2, these are strong and moderate, or supported by strong and moderate research. These are sort of the interventions that are reached kind of that highest level of confidence that something will be likely to work for you if it is aligned with your contextual needs. And then at tier 3, the research behind that, the evaluations behind that for various reasons doesn't quite rise to the level of tier 1 or 2 tier 2, but there is still a lot of really good evaluative research out there that suggests that these interventions will work. And then there is a 4th tier that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. It's tier 4, demonstrates a rationale. And this is a really interesting bucket of tiers. States are approaching the use of tier 4 interventions in different ways. Some of them aren't looking to use Tier 4 at all. But Ohio, we think that this is a valuable category, and we want to use it, but we want to put some guardrails around this, and here's why. Tier 4 interventions, they don't, the work that's been carried out on them thus far doesn't rise to the level of Tiers 1 through Tiers 3. But there has been work done to evaluate these or to look at these interventions. So we didn't just make these up out of the blue. There is a research base around Tier 4 interventions. And further, there's ongoing efforts, or there's plans for ongoing efforts to continue evaluating these interventions with the ultimate goal of potentially moving them up into a different tier. They're just not quite there yet. And so there may be good reason why you don't feel you can use an intervention that is a Tier 1 through Tier 3 at this point. Now, I want to say that we would strongly encourage you, whenever possible, to use Tiers 1 through Tiers 3, because there has been a lot of work done out there. And if there's something out there that we know is likely to work, why not use it? But again, depending on your circumstances or the specific needs, you may find that you're having a harder time finding an intervention that is a Tier 1 through Tier 3. I know that there are general concerns, for example, around interventions that will address specific needs for students with disabilities, or specific needs for students, or not students even necessarily, but children in birth through age 4. So I know there are some concerns out there about how many interventions have really already been evaluated and met the Tier 1 through Tier 3. So you may have good reason to use Tier 4, but if you decide to use Tier 4, in general, we want to put this out there on the table for people to use, but you need to keep in mind that it's going to take a little bit of work on your part, or a little bit additional work. One is that there has to be a research base, and so you'll have to have done some work around figuring out what that research base is and being able to explain what exists out there around this. It requires a logic model, a well-developed logic model explaining how do we go from having this need to using this intervention. How does that intervention get us to the point where we're improving our student outcomes? The third point here is there has to be a plan to evaluate that intervention so that we know whether it's working for you or not. Okay, so we briefly went through very high-level definitions, technical definitions. We'll get into a lot more detail a little bit later. But first, I just want to take a step even farther back and say, practically speaking, why is this important? Why are we talking about this? Again, it's not just to sort of check the box, like, I have to do this, so I'm going to do it. There's real value in using evidence-based interventions. I mean, as educators, you are faced with such a wide range of needs and limited resources often, right? And so any time that we can use something that has been proven to work or is likely to work, that's going to be certainly a more efficient way of approaching a problem, but also just a more timely way of addressing a particular problem. So the student who's sitting in your classroom today and needs help today, we don't necessarily want to be playing around with interventions that have no evidence of working when we know that student 4 months from now won't be in our classroom anymore, and then what? So it can be really valuable for folks in terms of just using resources in an efficient and effective way. All right, so why are you all here today hearing about this? Applicants for the Striving Readers Grant will be required to explain how they are going to meet their project goals using evidence-based interventions. That will be a required part of your application. And that explanation is going to need to explain how the intervention that you're proposing to use aligns with your context. It will need to explain what tier of evidence that intervention meets. So is it a Tier 1 through Tier 3, or is it a Tier 4? And you'll also need to give us a little bit of information about how you arrived at that conclusion. How do you know that it's a tier 1 level of evidence? And that's part of what we want to talk about here today, because we don't want you to have to go out and try to figure all this out necessarily on your own. REL Midwest has been working closely with us to develop some resource guides, some crosswalks, step-by-step guides. So hopefully we are going to be reducing the burden on you all to figure this out. And again, please, as you think of something that would be really helpful for you, let me know. And then last, as I said, if you're proposing to use a tier 4 intervention instead of a tier 1 through tier 3, we're going to want a little bit more information about that. Specifically, we're going to want to know why. We are going to want to see a description of the research base that supports that intervention. There will need to be a logic model, and then you'll also need to explain your plan for evaluating that intervention, including an explanation of who your research partner will be, who will be carrying out this evaluation, and that kind of information. And so the information about how you're going to be using evidence-based interventions will be included as part of the technical review, and we also look at that again during the peer review process. As I said, we're going to get into a lot of detail later, but I don't want anyone leaving here feeling overwhelmed in any way. I want you all to leave here feeling like you can do this, and it's exciting and going to lead to great things in your schools. And so this is sort of like 5 things. If you don't leave here with any other information, I want you to try to leave with these 5 things, and then come back to our webpage and get the other information too, because it can be helpful. First is just, again, understanding that this has an inherent value in it for your students and for your district. Second, always keep in mind local context, local context, local context is so important. I mean, one, just because, of course, practically speaking, if you're applying an intervention that really doesn't address your needs, that's just a waste of time and energy. And context is really, it is actually wrapped up in the very definitions of what it means to meet tiers 1 or tiers 2. If something isn't aligned with your population or your need, it can meet all of the other criteria for tier 1, and it still wouldn't really be a tier 1 intervention for you. Learn the basics. If you leave here saying to yourself, like, I never want to hear the words randomized control trial again, that's fine. The nerds among us, I don't understand. I can't empathize with that. I love hearing about this stuff. But you may leave here not wanting to talk about the statistics part of this again, and that's okay. What will be helpful is for you to have a basic understanding of the fact that there are tiers out there and what do they mean, just generally speaking, about the level of confidence that you can have in an intervention working for you. Make your interventions prove their worth. So again, selecting an evidence-based intervention is really important, but it is not the last step in the work that you're doing here. So the evidence definitions, when something meets a tier 1, it's proven to be likely to help you. But once you start implementing it in your district or your school or your classroom, you want to know that it's working for you, right? So once you start implementing that intervention, you're going to want to keep an eye on things, keep an eye on your data and the other information you have available to you so that you know whether it's working or not. And I am a big fan of the increasing work that's being done around rapid cycle evaluation, evaluations that don't necessarily take 2 or 3 years to tell you whether something's working or not, but rather taking a closer look at your data on a more regular basis and then making adjustments. They don't even necessarily have to be major adjustments or major overhauls, but just figuring out, this intervention hasn't resulted in exactly the outcomes that I expected. And maybe there are some tweaks that we can make to that will then lead to the outcomes that we expected. So look at your data. Make sure that intervention is actually doing what you expected it to do. And then 5, I imagine that when you leave here, you'll hopefully have a lot more information than you had when you walked in. When you get the application on Friday and you sit down to start to do this work, you may start to have questions that come up that you didn't necessarily think about today, or we're going to have resources, as I said, on the Striving Readers Grant webpage, including videos of this session and the PowerPoint presentations and a lot of other resources. But as I think I said at the beginning, this is really new stuff. And so the education field, the research field, everyone is responding to this now. And there are a lot of new discussions being had about this work, a lot of new resources being developed around this work. That's true for the state of Ohio as well. And so there is going to be a lot more forthcoming over indefinitely. So keep an eye out for the other sort of new materials that we put out there as a state, and feel free to reach out to me or others at the agency at any point to let us know, again, what could be helpful for you and where you might still have questions. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Davis.
My name is Liz Davis. I'm from REL Midwest at American Institutes for Research, and me and also my group of researchers and technical assistance providers have been working with the state to develop these resources for you all as you go on this journey of applying for these for Striving Readers grants, and also beyond that as well. So today, like Heather said, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about what is unpacking the standards of the Every Student Succeeds Act and what it means to be Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4. And beyond that, I'm going to introduce a couple of existing resources for identifying interventions to include in your Striving Readers grant applications. And then kind of putting it all together, I want to talk a little bit about how we align the ESSA standards with these existing clearinghouses that are already out there. And then if we have time, I hope we have time at the end, we can take some questions. Just a little plug before I start. The Regional Education Laboratories, we are REL Midwest. We cover the the Midwest states in the region. And we provide, we're funded through the Institute of Education Sciences and the Federal Department of Education. We provide research and technical assistance to states and districts, very much like what you're seeing here today. So let's first talk about the ESSA tiers of evidence, kind of unpacking each of those and what they mean and what goes into them. So there's 4 tiers, kind of ascending in rigor as you get to the top. Strong, moderate, promising, and demonstrates a rationale. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the first 3 because those are what aligns with the existing resources that are available. So the first tier is strong evidence. There's 5 or so criteria that goes into deciding whether an intervention or the outcomes in that intervention meet strong evidence. And the first thing is that you have to have, the intervention has to have been evaluated by a well-executed experimental study. So an experimental study is a randomized controlled trial or some other design that randomly assigns students or patients or participants or what have you into the treatment group and the control group. And there's a couple of things that go into a well-designed experimental study. The first is that the random assignment is uncompromised. Well, what does that mean, right? Every person in the pool that's going to be in the study needs to have an equal chance or an equal opportunity of being assigned to the treatment group or the control group. And it doesn't always have to be 50-50, but they all have to have the same chances, okay? And then once those assignments are made, once you've been randomly assigned into a treatment group or a control group, the researchers who are conducting the study cannot add people to a group. They cannot switch one person from one group to another, or they cannot drop participants for any reason. So that's what uncompromised means. So if I have a treatment group and a control group, and I find out that 2 of my students didn't actually get the intervention from the treatment group, I can't switch them to the control group. They have to stay in the treatment group because that compromises the randomness of the groups. And then the other part of being well executed means that you have low attrition. And basically all that means is that we need to have enough people stay in the study between being randomized into their groups and the intervention being evaluated, which is different from dropping people because they didn't get the intervention or they got the intervention when they weren't supposed to. So that is called attrition. It's basically the percentage of your participants who are still present at the end when it's time to analyze the results. And then another criteria is that you have to have a significant favorable effect on a relevant outcome. Interventions often purport to improve several different outcomes. For example, there is one, it's a horrible example because it's a literacy conference, but there's an algebra intervention called cognitive tutor. And the outcomes that it purports to improve are general algebra ability and geometry and general math ability, which are all in kind of different domains. So they are examined separately, but it's under the same intervention. So you will have, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail about this tomorrow if you're going to be in our workshop of, you might have one intervention with 4 different outcomes, and each of those outcomes are going to have a different answer to this question. Is it significant and favorable? What goes along with that significant favorable outcome is that you can't have any overriding negative outcomes. So you can't have on the same outcome. And from other causal designs. So studies where you can say with confidence that the intervention, yes, actually caused the outcome to change. The question that you need to ask yourself with this criteria is, what's my due diligence here? Do I have to scour the entire world of research to figure out if there's any countervailing evidence? No. My suggestion to you is just to look on your existing resources, clearinghouses, to see actually, and we'll see in a little bit, Works Clearinghouse does a very, very good job of actually just laying this information out at your feet. Another criteria is that for strong evidence is that the studies that looked at the intervention need to have, the samples need to be large, and in our definitions here today for striving readers and possibly for the state in general, a large sample means 500 students. And multi-site means that it was conducted, the effects were shown in more than one district. And one thing to note about this criteria is that you can actually, you can pool all the studies that look at the same outcome. You can pool the samples together to get your 500 and to get your multi-site. It doesn't have to be one study with this many students and this many sites. Again, as we'll see in a little bit, the Works Clearinghouse does a really great job of putting that information together for you. You just need to know where to look for it. And then finally, the last criteria for strong evidence is that is context, the population and setting that were present in the evaluation of the intervention need to overlap and align with your schools, your districts, your students' needs. That contextual piece is very important. So one, and Heather touched on this earlier, one, intervention or outcome that meets strong evidence for a certain district might not meet strong evidence for you if it doesn't match what your students' needs are based on your assessments. Now, I'm going to go into what the criteria are for moderate evidence, and I can tell you that the only real difference here is the way the treatment group and the control group are formed. So the only difference between experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs is quasi-experimental designs, or QEDs, as we call them, are not randomly assigned. There's no random assignment that happens. And to have a well-executed quasi-experimental design, there's two criteria. You have to do some kind of matching, whether it's statistical or purposeful. For example, if you have a district with some schools, 2 or 3 schools that are implementing a certain reading intervention, and you want to figure out, they've already implemented, and you want to figure out, well, is it having an effect? If you choose 2 or 3 other schools in the same district or even outside of the district that aren't implementing this program, then that have similar characteristics, that's the setup for a quasi-experimental design. And then you get to the second criteria where you have to have, within these designs, both the treatment group and the control group need to be similar, have similar attributes before the intervention was implemented. So going back to the example, the schools with the reading intervention versus the schools without the reading intervention, all those students need to be basically similar on, for example, prior reading scores before the intervention took place. So you would look at their standardized test scores from the year before the intervention was implemented, to make sure that they were similar at baseline. So those are the basics of what it means to be a quasi-experimental, well-executed quasi-experimental. And then the rest of these are the exact same criteria as strong evidence. So really the only difference between tiers 1 and 2, again, is how were the treatment and control groups formed? Were they random? Were they not random? If they weren't random, were they equivalent at baseline? So if you find a randomized controlled trial study online somewhere that is not already on the What Works Clearinghouse website or on Top Tier Evidence or on Blueprints, to decide whether a study meets tiers 1 or 2, it really requires a review against the What Works Clearinghouse standards. And to decide that, to do a review, you need a certified What Works Clearinghouse reviewer, or 2 of them actually. The process for evaluating or looking at these studies against the What Works Clearinghouse standards is you have 2 independent reviewers. They each do their own review of the study, and then they have a reconciler. And they never always agree 100%. It's a very complicated process. And I'm a certified reviewer, and there are parts of doing this process that I'm still barely grasping onto, and I've been doing it for a couple of years. So I would really highly discourage anybody from trying to go out and finding a randomized control trial and deciding whether or not it meets these tiers. So for now, what we're trying to do is just give you a whole lot of resources and tools to figure out or use what's out there already. For example, on the Works Clearinghouse to find interventions. So for promising evidence, we're switching gears a little bit because these aren't necessarily causal studies that we're looking at. So to meet promising evidence, or Tier 3, a study needs to be a well-designed and well-implemented correlational study. What that basically means is that you still have a treatment group and a control group, but they were just kind of existing. And baseline equivalence doesn't really factor into these designs or into this tier. What you need for a well-designed, well-implemented correlational study is you need to account for the differences between the two groups by statistically controlling for selection bias. And what I mean by that is, for example, I have a study where we looked at the association between participating in dual credit coursework and success in college, early college success. And that was defined by taking non-remedial coursework and persisting to a second year and things like that. So if I have my participation in dual credit programs as my intervention, and you have your treatment and control group are those who took the coursework or the treatment group, those who didn't are the control, and you have your outcome of early college success, well, there's a ton of other factors that are associated with early college success besides taking dual credit coursework. You have, your academic outcomes like your GPA and your standardized test scores and your college entrance exams, but there's also other very, very highly correlated factors such as socioeconomic status and gender and race. Those are all very highly correlated with early college success, unfortunately. So if you're going to have a well-executed or well-designed correlational study, you need to factor all of those other variables into your analysis so you can get a better picture, a truer picture of the association between taking dual credit courses and succeeding in college. So you're controlling for the selection bias. Just like with tiers 1 and 2, you need to have a positive outcome, statistically significant, favorable outcome, with no negative countervailing evidence from causal studies or studies that would qualify for tiers 1 and 2. It doesn't count if you find a study that's correlational that finds countervailing evidence. It's just with causal studies. A couple things to note about this tier. There is no large multi-site sample criteria for promising evidence, which is important. And is important because if you have a study or an intervention that is a randomized controlled trial or it's a quasi-experimental design, it was well implemented, it was well executed, but there was only 300 students total. So it can't meet strong evidence or it can't meet moderate evidence. It does meet promising evidence. Let me repeat that. If you have an RCT, experimental or quasi-experimental study that has everything but the sample size requirement, it can meet promising evidence. So it can, yes, it does. and I'll have a graphics later on to show how they align for a couple different clearinghouses. I want to make sure that I didn't do this last time, but I'm going to pause, and because I have people looking at me very intently, so I want to make sure that, is there any questions before we move on? That's correct. So the question is it a sorting issue, or is it one is better than the other? The differences between these tiers is rigor of the design, because, at least for tiers 1 through 3, it's, all of them have to show that there's positive outcomes with no negative countervailing outcomes. The difference between the designs is rigor. So at tier 1 is kind of the gold standard of the randomized control trial, where you can say with absolute confidence that the intervention is what caused the outcome. With moderate evidence, it's more of we can say with most confidence, like 95, 96% confidence that this is the intervention that caused the outcome, but because it wasn't randomized, there might be some unknown factor somewhere out there that could be, causing this. And then the other, the promising evidence is not causal, it's the association between the two. So it has to do with rigor. Okay? You're welcome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tier 4. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but it does have merit. It absolutely has a place in the conversation. That when you have, it's much less well defined than the first 3 tiers, but for an intervention to demonstrate a rationale, you really need, it has to be based on strong evidence. The logic model or the theory of action of getting from, I'm going to implement this intervention in this way, and it's going to do this, and then we're going to end up with improved breeding scores. That logic model has to be based on strong theory. And it has to explain how it purports to improve the outcomes. And then this is the one that vexes everyone. You have to show that an effort is underway or is going to be underway to actually assess the effectiveness of that intervention. The next step in this cycle is showing whether it meets tiers 1, 2, or 3, right? So if you're actually going to study the effectiveness of your, test that logic model, then you should have enough information to put it in one of the first 3 tiers. So it requires a lot more work because there's, for tiers 1 through 3, that work has already been done. This is just a recap of what we just talked about. And this is just the first 3 tiers, because as we move forward, I want to, we're going to talk about existing resources. And these are the tiers that align with the existing resources that are out there. So just very quickly, strong and moderate evidence are very much the same. The only difference is the design of the study. If it's random, if it's a random assignment, it goes in an experimental group. If it's not random assignments, but you have baseline equivalence, it goes into the moderate group. And then promising, again, it's correlational studies, and no baseline equivalence is necessary to meet this. But if you have a study that could meet 1 or 2 but doesn't have the large multi-site sample requirement, then you can put it into tier 3. So let's talk about existing. There's a ton of existing resources. A lot of the, what Works Clearinghouse is the biggest one. It's very expansive. It's very focused on education research. But there are others. I'm going to talk about, while I'm here this week, in the next 2 days, I'm going to talk specifically about 3 of them: What Works Clearinghouse, top tier evidence, and blueprints. But there are others, and they all have the different criteria for their standards. They all have their standards are named different things, and but if they give you enough information, you can align the ESSA tiers with their standards to make informed decisions about what interventions meet the ESSA tiers. So if we want to apply the ESSA standards to these existing resources, we need to find out more information depending on what clearinghouse we're in. So there's 4 things that we want to look for. We want to know the types of studies that are reviewed. That will determine the top tier, right? So if they're only doing randomized controlled trials, then every study that they look at has the potential to meet strong evidence. We want to look at the criteria that they factor into their ratings, and does it match what criteria ESSA uses for their ratings. We want to know how conflicting outcomes are handled, because that's a very big part of the ESSA criteria. And we also need to know what contextual information is provided, because as we've said before, every district is going to answer that last question differently. Does this align with my students and their needs? So that's what that is referring to. So let's talk about the What Works Clearinghouse. And again, full disclosure, I am most familiar with What Works Clearinghouse. I'm a certified reviewer under the 3.0 standards. They just came out with new standards, so everyone has to get recertified. Under What Works Clearinghouse, the types of studies that are reviewed, they do randomized controlled trials, experimental studies, and quasi-experimental studies. There's a couple of other types of experimental studies. They're called regression, discontinuity, and single case designs. That's all I'm going to say about them. That's all you really need to know. This is a lot of information, and it gets really technical, so I don't want to scramble anybody's brain with technical terms that are not necessary. So experimental and quasi-experimental designs is all they look at. There will be you will not find correlational studies on this clearinghouse, or actually any clearinghouse. The criteria that factors into their ratings, they look at the study design. How are the treatment and control groups formed? The free of confounding factors just means that there's nothing there's no factor that could explain the outcome other than the intervention. So an example would be, if I have a beautifully randomized, group of treatment and control students, but then for the intervention group, there was one teacher that gave the intervention, just one teacher, and then everybody else went about their daily business. Well, at the end of the day, we can't be certain if it was the intervention that changed the outcomes, or if it was something that the teacher did that affected the outcomes. So all it really means is that we can be certain a confounding factor is something that calls into question whether it's the intervention that actually had the effect on the outcome. Does it examine an eligible outcome? There's a bunch of different topic areas on the What Works Clearinghouse, and within each topic area they have different protocols for reviewing studies, and they're all freely available, publicly available on their website. And they all specify certain outcomes that they review. If there's one that falls out of the range of outcomes for that particular topic area, they just don't review it. So it's ineligible for review. They look at sample attrition. So for the experimental studies, they look at sample attrition. Again, how many participants left or dropped out during the study. And for quasi-experimental designs, they look at whether the two groups were similar enough on key characteristics at baseline or before the intervention started. So how are conflicting outcomes handled in the Works Clearinghouse? Well, I can tell you that the Works Clearinghouse does not factor outcomes into their actual ratings of their programs, of the interventions. They provide a bunch of information on what the outcomes were, but the outcomes don't factor into the ratings for the studies or the interventions, the outcomes. But there's kind of a two-tiered system here. For when you're on the website and you're looking at the list of interventions, they give these little icons for each intervention. And if the icon, and of course literacy is a book, if it's colored in and has a box around it, that means that there's at least one positive or potentially positive effect from that intervention. For some grade or some subgroup or what have you, there's at least one. If the icon is grayed out and doesn't have a box around it, that means that there were mixed effects or no discernible evidence. And then if it has a question mark on it, then there's no evidence. So if you're looking for interventions that are going to meet asset criteria, you want to look for this at first. So those interventions are going to have at least one positive or potentially positive effect. For the outcomes, they also have effectiveness ratings, or 6 effectiveness ratings. And they look a little bit like this. So their little icon here. For the double negative is a negative, meaning there's strong negative effectiveness. The outcome had negative effect. For potentially negative, it means that it's not as strong, but there are no countervailing positive outcomes. For 0, it's no discernible. There just wasn't an effect from the intervention on the outcome. And for mixed, it means exactly that, some positive and some negative on the same outcome. So if you're looking for interventions and outcomes to include in your Striving Readers applications, you want to stay away from these, because these are not going to meet tiers 1 through 3 because of that positive with no countervailing negative criteria. Okay? On the other hand, we have positive and potentially positive. Potentially positive means that yes, there is positive outcomes, and we have not found there are no countervailing negative outcomes. And then just plain positive is strong positive evidence of effectiveness. So these are the two that you want to look for to meet those top 3 ESSA tiers. Yes, there's a question. What I'm saying is there are a ton of filtering resources available to you on this website. There's a ton of other websites. This is just one example of them. There are, not every one of them is going to obviously meet your needs, but when you are looking through the Works Clearinghouse, if you are looking for interventions that are going to meet ESSA standards, then yeah, you need to look to those outcomes. And also, like I said before, the interventions can have several different outcomes, under the same intervention. So some, and every single one of them are going to have their own one of these ratings. And I have a list of other clearinghouses at the end. And again, that list that I put up at the end is just an example. So, but for my purposes, I'm most familiar with this, and that's why this is so lengthy. So again, this is what you're going to want to focus on to meet the ESSA tiers 1 through 3 when you're looking at your grant application. Works Clearinghouse provides a ton of contextual information. And you're going to need it to show that the intervention sample overlaps with your own and your needs. The summary of evidence pages provides the effectiveness rating for each outcome. It provides the number of studies that met the standards, the grades that were included, the overall number of students that were included in those studies that met the standards. It gives an improvement index, which is basically their calculated way of showing the magnitude of the difference between the treatment and the control groups. They have evidence snapshots, which are super user-friendly, colorful, infographics that sum up based on all of the studies that they looked at for a specific outcome. They'll give you things such as their racial and ethnic breakdown, gender, the percentage of English learners or percentage of free and reduced price lunch, the delivery method of the intervention. So they give you the locale sometimes. It's all pretty great information. Of course, most of the studies are going to look at the general population. I mean, that's just the nature of the education research that's out there. I think that there are a couple of different resources that even within Works Clearinghouse that might be useful to you if you want to talk afterwards. But what I would say about the conflicting standards is all these different clearinghouses have their own criteria. So of course they're not going to agree with each other 100% of the time. So you kind of have to keep that in mind and just know what you're looking for when you're deciding what intervention you want to use and why. And then finally, they provide WWC provides intervention reports. They go into a ton of detail. I would love to provide you all with the tools and resources that you need to not have to dig through these. But they do provide the program information, fidelity of implementation information. They provide cost of the intervention. They give a summary of all the studies that were reviewed, what studies met the standards, what studies didn't meet the standards, and the sample characteristics. And then there's not really three, there's 2 ratings. Like does not meet is not really a rating. If you meet the standards without reservations, that means that you are a randomized controlled trial with low attrition. It means that, yes, we can say with 100% that the intervention caused the outcome, that because of the randomized process and we had enough students stay, that we do not have any reservations about the effectiveness of this intervention. With reservations, it's a little bit below that. It's yes, the intervention caused the outcome, but there might be some other unknown variable that we're not measuring, but probably not. So this is the basic flow chart of what Works Clearinghouse for determining without and with reservations. So were the treatment and control groups decided through a random process? If they were, does the study have low attrition? If it does, it meets without reservations. If it wasn't a random process, then the study needs to establish or show baseline equivalence in that the groups were equal before the intervention took place. And if they did, then they meet group design standards with reservations. So that's the basic process. Now, this is all well and good, but what does this have to do with your applications? Well, we can align, knowing what we know, we can align the WWC standards with the ESSA tiers. So we have meet standards without reservations and meet standards with reservations. And they follow kind of the same path here. If you have a study that meets standards without reservations with a positive or potentially positive outcome with no countervailing negative outcomes and a large multi-site sample, that aligns with strong evidence. Okay? If meet standards without reservations does not have a large multi-site sample but still has the positive or potentially positive outcomes, that means promising evidence. That aligns with promising evidence. Because remember, promising evidence has this criteria of positive outcomes with no countervailing negative outcomes, but does not have the large multi-site criteria to meet promising. And then if they don't have a positive or potentially positive outcome, they don't meet tiers 1 through 3, because that's a must. And then the same thing with the meet standards with reservations. If you have a positive or potentially positive outcome and a large multi-site sample, that aligns with moderate evidence, or tier 2. Again, if you are missing the large multi-site sample, you are promising. And if there's no positive outcome, then you don't meet the standards for ESSA. So this apparently is available. There will be a couple of other things too that go into a little bit more detail about what all this means. So I'm going to kind of go through this one other clearinghouse. It's called Top Tier Evidence. It's from the National Coalition of Evidence-Based Policy, I believe. They're much smaller. Their criteria is much more stringent. So their list of interventions that meet their standards is a lot smaller. They don't just do education research. They're in community development and health outcomes and stuff like that. So the types of studies that Top Tier Evidence reviews, they only do randomized control trials. That's it. They don't do quasi-experimental designs, just randomized control trials. The criteria that factor into their ratings, the design has to do with, just like with the Works Clearinghouse, they look at implementation fidelity. They look at positive outcomes. They have to be sustained effects. They have to do follow-up analysis to make sure that the outcomes are still present a year later. They count how the effects are reported. They're pretty stringent. And then the conflicting outcomes for top tier are, they're very strict. Not only can you have no countervailing negative evidence, you can have no countervailing null effects. Meaning, if you have a positive outcome over here and no, we didn't find any discernible evidence over here, that doesn't meet their standards. They all have to be positive. So the contextual information they provide everything that you need to align your population with theirs. They have evidence summaries. They give the sample size so you can decide whether it meets that criteria. They give the sample characteristics. They talk about the region of the country where the studies were done. They talk about the cost of the intervention. But it's not as user-friendly. Readers really, you do need to dig through the reports. So they have 2 ratings. They have top tier and they have near top tier. Now top tier is a well-designed RCT in replicable settings. Like it has to be, you have to be able to be, it has to be able to be replicated. Large sustained effects. They say they must have a large sample, but their large sample does not always align with ESSA's large sample requirement. And then for near top tier, it basically, it needs more replication. So they're not multi-site. So to align these, it's a lot simpler. It's for top tier, if you have a large multi-site sample, yes, it meets strong evidence. If you don't, it meets promising evidence. If you are near top tier, you are promising because it's not a multi-site sample. And then these are the other clearinghouses that I was talking about before. There's more out there than this. This is all available on the slides, I think. So thank you all very much. Okay.